A man waits alone in the mountains, Hollis Miller, and the very mountains know his name, though few voices speak it aloud. Years have passed since he chose solitude over society, since he built his cabin from timber he felled himself, since he learned that silence could be a companion as true as any living thing. The winter wind that year was relentless, testing the walls he had built, both wooden and otherwise. And it was during one such bitter evening, when frost gathered at the corners of his world like something hungry and patient, that a sound broke through the darkness. A knock, not gentle, not certain, desperate. Hollis had grown accustomed to the language of wind and animal, but this was the language of human fear, and he recognized it instantly, though he had not heard it in years. He opened the door into blackness and found her there. A girl, barely old enough to understand the weight of what she carried. Her name was Laura May, and she trembled not from cold alone. The girl spoke of her mother, Mary Ellen Carter, and spoke of brutality so complete that even the mountains seemed to bow their heads. She spoke of a man named Elias Carter, her father, whose fists had become his only argument, whose rage had become a force that consumed everything in its path. Hollis stood in the threshold between his ordered world and the chaos that now demanded entry. The choice seemed impossible in that moment, to turn away and return to his peace, or to step forward and surrender it entirely. But Hollis was not a man of philosophy. He was a man of instinct, and every instinct in him recognized that Laura May represented something he could not refuse, a crisis of the innocent. He took the girl inside. The snow deepened around his cabin that night, and Hollis Miller, who had spent years perfecting the art of solitude, became, in an instant, something else entirely. He became a rescuer. He became a protector. And though he did not know it yet, he became a man whose life was about to be irrevocably altered by forces beyond his control or understanding. The path to the Carter homestead was one Hollis had never wanted to travel. He followed Laura May through white darkness, through snow that deepened with each step, through a landscape that seemed to actively resist their purpose. The girl moved with the certainty of a child who knows her home, yet each step appeared to cost her something, courage or hope or both. Hollis moved behind her, a giant of a man, his frame massive in the winter night, and yet his movements were careful, deliberate, almost apologetic for the space he occupied in the world. They arrived at a structure that bore the marks of poverty and despair. The Carter home was not a place of warmth. It was a place where warmth went to die. And when Hollis stepped inside, he found Mary Ellen Carter in conditions that confirmed every fear Laura May's words had carried. She lay upon a worn bed in a back room, her body a landscape of violence. Bruises mapped a history across her face and arms, not recent marks alone, but accumulated evidence of a lifetime lived under domination. Her eyes, when they opened to see Hollis, held something beyond fear. They held the peculiar look of someone who had surrendered to the belief that mercy had abandoned the world. Hollis did not speak. He had learned long ago that words often diminished what action could accomplish. He wrapped Mary Ellen in blankets, carefully as though she might shatter at rough contact, and he carried her from that place. Laura May walked beside them, and perhaps she walked a little lighter now, knowing that someone else was bearing part of the burden she had carried alone. The journey back through the winter was an act of quiet defiance. Each step was a statement against the world's indifference. Each step was Hollis Miller saying, without voice, without hesitation, that he would no longer be a man who stood aside while others suffered. He had spent years building walls to keep the world out, but tonight he tore those walls down from the inside. When they reached his cabin, Hollis transformed it from a solitary refuge into a place of sanctuary. He prepared a room with clean linens. He built the fire higher than he had in months. He brewed medicines from knowledge he had accumulated in his years of isolation, knowledge of which herbs could soothe, which preparations could ease pain. He worked through the night with the devotion of someone who had found purpose. And in that darkness, as wind howled around the cabin and snow accumulated against the walls, Hollis Miller became something he had not been in a very long time. He became necessary. And there was, despite the complications, despite the danger, something that felt like rightness in that transformation. News travels strangely in small communities, not through conversation alone, but through the eyes of those who notice, through the spaces between words where suspicion lives and breeds. Within days, the frontier town had begun its whispered dialogue about Hollis Miller and the woman now staying in his cabin. The stories multiplied and mutated. Scandal became the currency of the community, and judgment became the pastime of those with little else to occupy their time. Hollis had anticipated this. He had known that compassion, in places shaped by hardship and isolation, was often misread as transgression, that a man and a woman under one roof became immediately suspect, that the innocent act of offering shelter could be transformed into something sordid by the mechanics of small-town morality. What he had not fully anticipated was the depth of that judgment, the way it seemed to poison even the kindest interpretations. People who might have helped turned away. Supplies that might have been shared were withheld. The preacher, a man who spent each Sunday speaking of charity and forgiveness, looked through Hollis as though he had become invisible, as though helping the vulnerable somehow made one complicit in their degradation. Mary Ellen, recovering in Hollis's cabin, felt the weight of this judgment in ways that cut deeper than any physical wound. Laura May, growing stronger each day, began to understand that her rescue came with a price. Her mother had been saved from one form of violence only to be positioned within another, the violence of collective disdain. Hollis endured this with stoicism. He did not defend himself because defense implied that others' opinions held power over him, and he had chosen long ago that solitude meant freedom from such calculations. But watching Mary Ellen struggle beneath the psychological weight of being called improper, watching Laura May learn that the world was not reliably kind or just, this cost him something. It cost him the last of his innocence regarding human nature. He had known that people could be cruel, but he had perhaps not known, not fully, not in his bones, how completely a community could weaponize shame against those it deemed unworthy of defense. How the machinery of social judgment could grind the vulnerable to dust as efficiently as any storm. And yet, within his cabin, something continued to flourish. Mary Ellen grew stronger, not just physically, but in some deeper way. The light returned to her eyes. Laura May began to laugh, a sound so rare in that house of refuge that it seemed to carry the force of something sacred. These small victories were weapons against the darkness, and Hollis Miller, who had chosen isolation to escape human complexity, found himself now fighting, in the only way he knew how, to protect these victories against a world that seemed determined to deny them. Days accumulated into weeks, and Hollis's cabin became a kind of temporal island, a place where normal time seemed to operate differently, where healing followed its own rhythm rather than the rhythm of seasons or calendars. Mary Ellen's physical wounds closed, but the deeper injuries, the ones written into her very sense of self, required a different kind of time. They required patience and constancy. Hollis provided both without being asked. He fell into patterns that sustained all three of them. He worked the land surrounding his cabin. He hunted. He maintained the structure against the elements. He prepared food, and he cleaned. These mundane acts became a language, a way of saying to Mary Ellen and Laura May, "You are worth this effort. Your existence matters. Your lives will not be lived in chaos, but in order and care." The waiting was its own form of ordeal, though. Hollis knew, even as he worked, that this domestic arrangement existed in a kind of provisional state, that Mary Ellen could not hide in his cabin forever, that eventually the world would demand its reckoning, that Elias Carter, a man whose pride had been wounded by his wife's disappearance, would not indefinitely accept her absence. In some sense, Hollis was waiting for this collision. He did not speak of it, but each night, as he lay in his bed and heard the wind negotiate with the mountain, he knew he was waiting. He was preparing his mind for violence without pursuing it, the way one prepares for a storm, by securing what is loose and strengthening what is weak. Mary Ellen, in her own way, was waiting too. She experienced something like rebirth in that cabin, a slow reconstruction of the self that Elias Carter's fists had attempted to destroy. She moved through Hollis's home with growing confidence. She began to see herself not as a victim defined by brutality, but as a survivor capable of defining herself. And yet, beneath this reconstruction lived a terror, the knowledge that the man who had made her into a victim still existed in the world, that his claim upon her, legal and psychological and brutal, had not been relinquished. Laura May, younger and more resilient in that particular way of children, seemed almost to flourish. She helped Hollis with tasks. She read from the few books in his cabin. She seemed, in moments, to have forgotten the brutality that had driven her to his door. But Hollis saw the moments when fear would flash across her face, ancestral fear, inherited from her mother, and he would understand that no child could be immune to the knowledge of her parents' violence. The three of them inhabited a kind of beautiful temporary arrangement, each knowing it could not last, each waiting for the moment when reality would reassert itself and demand a resolution neither could predict. And then came the night when the sky seemed to split open and the mountains themselves seemed to shake with fury. A storm gathered with the inevitability of a predator, with the certainty of something long anticipated finally arriving. Hollis, looking out toward the darkness, knew with perfect clarity that Elias Carter would come on such a night, that a man whose pride had been wounded would not wait for rational opportunity. He would come when anger was his only guide. The first sign was sound, the approach of someone who made no effort at concealment or quiet. Elias Carter was a man whose rage operated on the assumption that brutality was the only language worth speaking. He came on horseback through the storm, and when he reached the cabin he did not knock as his daughter had. He demanded entry, as though the very world operated under his command. Hollis opened the door. What stood before him was a man diminished by alcohol and rage into something barely human. Elias Carter's face was a mask of fury, the face of someone who had come not to negotiate or reclaim, but to destroy. He spoke of ownership, he spoke of rights, he spoke of the violation that had been perpetrated against him when his wife dared to seek shelter in another man's home. Hollis listened to these words with an expression that betrayed nothing. He stood in the doorway, a giant of a man, and he embodied something that Elias Carter could not fathom: quiet refusal. The absolute statement, no, you will not have her. You will not have them. You will not enter this place and resume your violence. The confrontation escalated with terrible inevitability. Elias Carter attempted to force his way inside. He raised his fists, the same fists that had beaten his wife into submission, and he believed in his alcoholic certainty that these fists would once again achieve their purpose. He believed that violence was universal language that all men understood. He did not understand Hollis Miller. The fight that followed was not a theatrical display. It was brutal and brief. It was a collision between someone motivated by anger and someone motivated by principle. Hollis did not seek to destroy Elias Carter. He did not permit his superior strength to become a vehicle for retribution. Instead, he contained him. He subdued him. He held him with the firm clarity of someone who had decided, in advance and without hesitation, that restraint was the truest form of strength. And as the storm raged around the cabin, as lightning illuminated the mountains and thunder echoed from peak to peak, Hollis Miller completed his metamorphosis. He transformed from a man of solitude into a man of justice. He did not take vengeance. He did not repay violence with violence. Instead, he subdued Elias Carter with the same care he had used to carry Mary Ellen from her place of captivity. When it was finished, when the storm had exhausted itself and dawn began its preliminary approach, Hollis Miller had not become the monster his community might have expected. He had become something far more threatening to the world's simple narratives. He had become a man who could have taken revenge and had chosen restraint instead. The morning arrived with silence rather than sound, the particular quietness that follows great storms, as though the world itself required recovery. Hollis Miller bound Elias Carter with materials from his own homestead. He did this without anger or satisfaction. He did this as one completes a necessary task. The law in that region was represented by a man called Sheriff Thomas, a person who had spent years navigating the impossible middle ground between enforcement and pragmatism. When Hollis appeared in town with Elias Carter in custody, leading his prisoner through the settlement with the grimness of a man completing an obligation, the sheriff understood immediately what had occurred. But what struck Sheriff Thomas, what seemed to reverberate through his understanding of events, was that Hollis had brought his prisoner to justice rather than executing him. In a frontier where men often took their grievances into their own hands, where violence begot more violence in an endless cycle, Hollis Miller had broken that cycle. He had chosen the law. The decision reverberated through the community in ways both immediate and delayed. Elias Carter was taken into custody. The circumstances of his imprisonment emerged. The brutality toward Mary Ellen, the years of domination, the flight of his daughter to seek help. The narrative shifted. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the community began to reassess its judgment. The same people who had condemned Hollis Miller for offering shelter now began to question the righteousness of their condemnation. The preacher who had avoided his gaze now spoke of forgiveness and mercy. The women of the town who had gossiped about Mary Ellen began tentatively to recognize her as a survivor rather than as an impropriety. But for Hollis, this shift in social opinion brought little satisfaction. He had not protected Mary Ellen and Laura May to achieve community acceptance. He had protected them because it was the right thing. The social validation that now arrived felt, in some fundamental way, irrelevant to his purposes. What mattered was that Mary Ellen could walk through the town with her head raised, that Laura May could attend school without bearing the weight of collective judgment, that a particular form of darkness had been interrupted, not ended, never fully ended, but interrupted in this one place, in this one family. The legal process moved with its characteristic slowness, but Elias Carter would face consequences for his actions. The law would render its judgment, and in doing so, it would validate what Hollis had already known, that brutality was not acceptable, that domination could not be permitted to continue indefinitely, that even in places where human systems were imperfect and fragile, there remained the possibility of justice. The cabin that had been a place of refuge now became something more complex. It became a place of transition. Mary Ellen moved through the process of understanding that her life would not return to what it had been. She could not return to Elias Carter. But neither could she simply remain suspended in Hollis's home, dependent upon his kindness, grateful but ultimately diminished. She required a new path, and this was perhaps the most difficult challenge of all, not the physical recovery from violence, but the psychological reconstruction of a woman who had been taught through years of brutality that she possessed no agency of her own. Hollis understood this without being told, and so he began gently to step back from the role of protector and into the role of witness. He allowed Mary Ellen to make decisions about her own future. He provided counsel when asked, but refrained from direction. He created space for her to discover that she possessed the capacity to determine her own course. Laura May watched this transformation with the particular clarity of a child who had been forced too early into adulthood. She saw her mother's fear gradually being replaced by something that looked almost like purpose. She saw a woman who had been told repeatedly that she was worthless beginning to recognize her own value. And Hollis, in bearing witness to this metamorphosis, completed his own transformation. He had begun as a solitary man, avoiding the complexity of human connection. He had been drawn into action by a desperate child. But now, in this phase of quiet observation, he was learning something more subtle. He was learning that protecting people sometimes meant allowing them to protect themselves. That strength was not always active, that sometimes the greatest gift one could offer was the space in which another person could discover their own power. The cabin had been filled with the sound of crisis and recovery. Now it filled with something quieter but equally profound, the sound of reconstruction, of a woman learning to speak in her own voice, of a child learning to trust that adults might be reliably kind, of a man learning that isolation was sometimes a wound rather than a solution. And beneath these quiet transformations lived a deeper truth, that healing is never swift, never complete, but is always possible for those who have the courage to attempt it. That redemption, not as moral absolution but as practical transformation, could occur in the most unexpected places, in the company of the most unlikely saviors. The seasons turned, and Hollis's cabin underwent a peculiar metamorphosis. It was no longer the isolated refuge of a solitary man. It had become a place of passage, a location where lives were reconstructed and futures were reimagined. Mary Ellen began to speak of plans, of possibilities, of a future that did not depend upon male protection but upon her own capacity and determination. She had learned a trade, the preparation of medicines, the care of land, and she spoke of establishing herself in a small settlement to the south, of building a life that was hers alone. Hollis listened to these plans with a complex mixture of satisfaction and something deeper, perhaps loss, perhaps the recognition that the purpose which had briefly brought him into connection with the world was drawing to a close. Laura May had grown during her time in the cabin. She had learned to read with greater proficiency. She had learned that a girl's life was not predetermined by her parents' failures. She spoke of attending school in a proper town, of becoming a teacher perhaps, of using the skills of literacy to open doors that had been closed to her mother. The very fact that she could imagine such futures, futures not constrained by brutality or necessity, was itself a kind of miracle, and Hollis recognized it as such. He had given her not wealth, but possibility. He had given her safety in which possibility could grow. And then came the morning when Mary Ellen approached Hollis with words that seemed to cost her considerable effort. She spoke of gratitude, but more than that. She spoke of having learned, through his example, that men could be kind, that strength did not require cruelty, that a human being could build a life based on principle rather than power. She spoke these things while tears moved slowly down her face, not tears of sorrow alone, but of release, of the acknowledgement that the woman she had become was not a woman who could be broken again, that her transformation, while it had depended partly upon Hollis's intervention, had ultimately depended upon her own will, her own determination to survive and transcend. Hollis, who had spent years avoiding emotional complexity, found himself unmade and remade by this moment. He understood that he had not saved Mary Ellen. He had merely created the conditions in which she could save herself. This seemed, in a way he struggled to articulate, more profound than simple rescue. As the days approached for Mary Ellen and Laura May to depart, to move into their new lives, to pursue their own trajectories, the cabin seemed to expand. It contained multitudes now. It was not just the space of a solitary man, but the intersection point of several lives that had been forever altered by their convergence. And Hollis Miller, as he watched them prepare to leave, understood something fundamental about the nature of strength. It was not the capacity to remain untouched by the world. It was not the preservation of pristine isolation. It was, instead, the capacity to open oneself to the world's complexity and pain and to respond with constancy and care. He would return to solitude after they left. The mountains would reclaim their dominion. The silence would return to his cabin. But he would not be the same man who had opened his door to a desperate child months before. He would carry forward the knowledge that compassion was not weakness. That community, brief and fragile though it might be, was more valuable than the armor of solitude. And in the settlement that bore witness to these events, the narrative would continue to evolve. The preacher would speak with genuine warmth of Hollis Miller's redemptive sacrifice. The townspeople would remember him with something approaching reverence, not quite sainthood, but something rare and profound, a man who had chosen to be human in the most complete sense. A man who understood that the greatest battles were not those fought against enemies, but those fought within oneself for the right to remain kind in a world that often punished kindness. And perhaps, in some small corner of the frontier's vast and unforgiving landscape, a new story was beginning to take shape. A story about a giant rancher and the woman and child he had sheltered. A story that would be told and retold, distorted and clarified by time and distance. But beneath all the variations, the core would remain. That mercy was possible, that violence could be interrupted, that a single act of compassion could ripple outward and touch lives in ways impossible to predict or fully comprehend. The mountains knew this story. They had witnessed it through wind and storm and season, and they would carry it forward into the endless future, a testament to what was possible when a man chose to open his heart rather than close it further. And as the night deepened over those lonely mountains, the wind carried more than the sound of the storm. It carried the start of something none of them could yet understand. But that, my friend, is a tale for another time. If this story rode its way into your heart, go on and leave a trail behind. Tell me down in the comments where you're listening from out there in this wide, wild world. Hit that like button if the silence of the mountains still echoes in your mind. And don't forget to saddle up and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of a gentle giant's reckoning. Until then, keep your fire burning low and your heart wide open.